Hi, I'm Cornus van der Lucht. In this concluding session 6, we will look at the theme of time and scale. In the previous session, you heard about the organizing principles of becoming the resource revolution enterprise. Here we will look at ways of moving in terms of time and scale to your business ecosystem and the circular economy. Session 6 takes us to the economy stage of the zero nautics transformation process as described by John Elkington. And the question now is how we can push entire industries' value chains through the sustainability threshold into the so-called resource revolution. The economy stage of the transformation process of zero nautics is a time that requires, as John Elkington put it, it calls for some unreasonable leadership. Unreasonable in the sense that we're on the lookout for management leadership that is willing to break out of some conventional timescales and the seeming pressure from markets to force management into short-termism and mere quarterly results. Related to the issue of timing, we also know from various examples historically that the right technology innovation may be out there, but the market is not ready yet. Related to the issue of scale as well, the findings of various reports of the International Resource Panel makes it evident that we need to introduce these resource productivity improvements at a massive scale. We spoke earlier about the need to meet the mass market threshold. Now, related to the theme of time and scale, we'll tackle some difficult issues in this concluding session. First of all, as highlighted there in slide 4, optimal product life cycle, optimal investment decision-making time frame, economies of scale, which with it brings the risk of diseconomies of scale. The next one is value chain partnering, and then we'll conclude with some thoughts about champions. Now, looking at the optimal product lifetime. Renewed interest today in Europe and in countries such as Japan and China in the circular economy reflects an interest and a debate that goes way beyond the old discussion on waste regulation and waste legislation. The interest here, if you go to the level of the enterprise and products as well, is looking beyond simply redesign of products to minimize resource inputs and minimize waste. But additionally, the emphasis here is how we can get more value of the product after the initial use phase of that product. It brings to mind the ideas of closed-loop manufacturing and closed-loop cycles of materials use, as described by, for example, Amory Lovins and his partners in the 1990s when they described what they called the services and flow economy. And in this situation, your enterprise may be feeling pressure from the regulator, gradually introducing certain taxes that sends a certain market signal and that indicates that over coming years, the use of certain resources or materials will progressively face a certain tax burden. Your enterprise may also decide we're not going to wait for regulatory pressure, we're going to take the initiative and potentially collectively with peers, others in your industry or beyond, to initiate some voluntary initiative, some self-regulatory exercise, or the creation of a private standard. And we know the conveniences of having standards. They reduce uncertainty and they, for example, create a benchmark for measuring progress and performance. Now, if we look at an optimal product lifetime, at stake here is not only the market lifetime or commercial lifetime of that product, but also the physical lifetime of the product. What is the disconnect between these different lifetimes, and what is the reason for that? Take a few minutes to reflect in your own enterprise, looking at your own products and services. What is the optimal lifetime of those technologies that you are rolling out, of the products and services that you take to the market? Have you discussed the optimal lifetime of the products of your business with LCA experts? Have you discussed this issue with experts inside your own business? Have you discussed it with the R&D department recently, or the strategy department? Is this a discussion you can take up following this online course on the resource revolution? On slide 7, we highlight a quote from this article by Michael Porter and his colleagues in the Harvard Business Review, focused on smart, connected products. And in this quote, you see an emphasis on the willingness of us as consumers, as well as various types of clients, including businesses, to be more open to sharing certain products that we use less often. Think of that extreme inefficiency involved, for example, in the personal motor vehicle, that 90%, 96% in fact, of its time is standing somewhere parked and not getting used. To what extent are we ready as consumers and as businesses to be more focused on the continued usage of the same shelf or the same product with a content that continuously or regularly gets upgraded and modernized and improved? And this is the type of logic that you will also see today when vehicle manufacturers such as Tesla looks beyond the electrical vehicle to electrical buses and trucks, when Mercedes-Benz looks into the future bus, or where their peer in China, BID, looks at the same type of issue, a willingness to share the same pieces of equipment, for example, in the form of public transport. All of this involves moving away from what was called the throwaway society by Hawken and Lovins in their 1990s book, Natural Capitalism. We move on to a brief discussion on the optimal time frame in investment decision making. As we saw, your resource productive technology that you're rolling out in the market needs to cross a certain threshold. It needs to present a certain breakthrough, a 50 to 80% productivity improvement. And once that threshold of meeting the mass market is crossed, there's likely to be a burst in market demand. And in preparation for this, the authors of the book, The Resource Revolution, advises companies to make the proper investments at least 2 product cycles in advance. Now, the length of the product cycle, as we said before, depends on your industry, your business. It may be only 6 months or 12 months in the case of a mobile phone. It may be 7 years in the case of a motor vehicle. But consider this challenge to make the proper investment and preparation 2 product cycles in advance, to be prepared for that time when you have the burst in market take-up and crossing that chasm that we spoke about earlier. The issue of timing is not an easy one. As I said earlier, we've seen a number of cases where the right technology invention is out there, but the market is not ready. The classical example is the microwave oven, invented in the 1940s, but it reached the mass market stage only in the 1970s. And then look at the technology of light bulbs, invented in the late 19th century, and then for decades we continued to use a highly inefficient technology. In more recent times, we had the addition of the compact fluorescent bulbs, which brought their own risks, notably the use of mercury as a substance. And today, if we look at the LED light, the background of which goes to early the previous century, only today reaching on a commercially competitive basis the mass market. A product that introduces a factor 10 efficiency improvement in electricity use compared to the traditional incandescent light. Now, rolling out a new technology into the market, of course, is a complicated business. It involves consumers having to be convinced about quality and quantity. And this is not only a question of quantity and price, this is also a question of quality. Think of the historical example of the iPod that took over usage of the old Walkman. The iPod, a significantly more expensive product, but obviously consumers were convinced and impressed by all the additional benefits and functionalities that it introduced. But the issue of upfront investment costs can be a deterrent, as many of you would know, for various types of clients. Consumers would typically expect a payback period of not more than 2 years, and many businesses would expect a payback period of not more than 4 years. So taking that high upfront investment or the capital intensity out of the equation is a critical challenge to be taken on by financial institutions. Here is a key role that can be taken on by financial institutions. And then if we consider economies of scale, scaling is notoriously difficult, and it involves taking that product from the initial experimental stage, from the lab, through the piloting phase to the commercial phase. And you need to be sure that you are ready in terms of consumer or user mindsets. And you also need to think in terms of a complete value chain and consider to what extent that whole delivery ecosystem is ready in terms of having the necessary resources and quality suppliers available. The history of solar power has also shown us that the right technology may be available, but what was decisive in the end in taking this on a commercially competitive basis into the mass market was introducing a certain business model, a leasing business model, that removed this barrier of the seeming high upfront investment costs and the seeming complications of having solar panels installed at your own premises. The leasing business model takes that initial distraction out of the equation. And again, enabling that leasing model, key was this role player, the financial institution, in collaborating with energy suppliers in making this happen. Still on the topic of economies of scale, it also brings, as I said, the risks of diseconomies of scale, of which we see examples in the agricultural industry. In the last century, we've seen increasingly industrialization of agriculture, and in more recent decades, we've also seen increasingly the so-called financialization of the agricultural industry. We've seen the introduction of new financial instruments and growing speculation against commodity prices. And all of this has major implications for the distribution and the price of food. The land use report of the International Resource Panel highlights that fluctuating prices is a core problem for stable food supplies globally. We move on to the topic of value chain partnering. Research by the WTO, World Trade Organization, and the OECD has shown how in a post-Cold War world, thanks to globalization during the 1990s and onwards, global value chains have become increasingly expanded. Whereas in the past one could focus on trade between countries A and B and products life cycles that involve maybe 2 countries Today, it's rather a matter of looking at countries A, B, C, D, and E. Research by the World Trade Organization and UNCTAD, for example, highlights that depending on the complexity of the product, in some cases you may have products that involve 25 categories of activities. So if we look at the emergence of global value chains, or what some researchers call global production networks, trade economists would refer to global value chains that are increasingly fragmented. Production globally that is increasingly fragmented. Fragmented in the sense of various geographies, countries involved in the life cycle, the complete life cycle of various types of products. And the challenge for you, of course, as potentially a large enterprise, potentially a multinational enterprise, is to consider how in the midst of fragmented global production processes, you can tie the different knots together and enable a decentralized, networked organization to function efficiently, among others through the intelligent use of software and information technologies as described in this online course. With this also comes the fact that external supplies increasingly represent a major share of your operating costs. In manufacturing, it is estimated that external supplies can easily represent 2/3 of operating costs. In the service industries, external supplies can represent 1/3 easily of operating costs. All of this means that the procurement function takes on a very critical role, a role that has a direct impact on profits. Dealing with this, also consider the fact that typically if we looked at the amount of material resources that go into a final product, typically the amount of material resources that initially went into the production of that product is 10 times the level of what actually ends up in the final product. Now, addressing these and the related costs, the related risks and opportunities, you can consider various options of partnering with your suppliers. Some of these options have been highlighted in the 2000s in a publication by UNEP and Sustainability with the title Unchaining Value. I encourage you to look at that publication. Research by the consultancy A.T. Kearney has, for example, highlighted how only a 5% reduction in waste through collaboration with suppliers could result in a doubling of a company's profit margins. So there's a number of exciting opportunities here for you to explore through value chain partnering. Hick and Rogers, the authors of the book The Resource Revolution, highlights some tactics for you to follow as you take your new technology to the market. Making sure that it fits appropriately into the surrounding ecosystem, including your business ecosystem. The tactics they recommend, highlighted on slide 13, are, for example, early field testing, rapid prototyping, design for manufacturability, supply chain management that is integrated, standard operating procedures effectively shared with your supply chain partners, the adapting and integration of technologies, where necessary, copying and improving on what others are doing, and finally having clarity that you have that supporting infrastructure in place. And that includes, examples such as in the case of electrical vehicles, having the necessary battery charging stations in place, a network of those to support the use of electrical vehicles that may take various forms, including public transport. The final theme related to time and scale that we're looking at here is the role of champions. If you look at our world today, absolute decoupling seems to be the exception rather than the rule. And this highlights again the fact that we clearly need a certain quality of leadership here. Leaders that are willing to function as change agents. Leaders that are, as I said earlier, able to articulate a certain vision and able to excite people, employees, customers, clients, consumers. Leaders that are able to overcome certain behavioral biases that exist in the market, behavioral biases that you may find within your own company as well, including some pushback by certain departments. And this requires a certain mindset of the change agent. Typical barriers they come across inside the enterprise is highlighted by the book, The Resource Revolution, including recommendations by Heck and Rogers of how to overcome these. That includes the ability at times to take your management out of the focus on quarterly result cycles. Take them away at times to a remote place, to have that helicopter view and have a more in-depth and critical discussion around the assumptions of your current business model and the type of products and services that you are delivering. Another tip there is assigning special attention and resources to emerging market opportunities. Consider the example of the company Google that allows its employees to spend a certain percentage of their work time to focus on a specific theme, whatever it may be, that is of special interest to them. The type of champions we're looking at here, a topical example today as well, is that of the entrepreneur, the South African-born Elon Musk, CEO of Tesla, leading a company that today is focusing, as I said earlier, not only on individual personal vehicles, but also buses, public transport, and trucks. We look at another example of a champion, one that is famous in Korea. Lee Kun-hee, long-standing CEO of the company Samsung, who took over leadership of the company from his father in the 1980s, who founded the company in 1938. A company that's gone through a long evolution, involved in various industries, as highlighted on slide 15. And what Lee Kun-hee did in the 1990s is he visited companies in Western Europe and North America. He had a look at innovations and the latest trends in quality management, and he was struck by the lack of quality in their own production of electronic products. And that led to some very serious and in-depth discussions with internal management, bringing about a radical transformation in that company. And one strategy the company pursued over the years is to spot technology transition points and then very quickly catching up with incumbents in that area. In more recent years, the company, for example, in 2010, announced an investment of over $20 billion in high-growth business areas, notably clean technology, including various types of resource-productive technologies. And that includes also moving into the area of offshore wind energy generation. So that will be an exciting story to follow, looking at the example as well of the leadership shown at the company Samsung in Korea. So as we conclude session 6, we have, as with all these sessions, additional reading material for you to look at, plenty of food for thought to reflect on. And those additional reading materials include various exercises where we also encourage you to go and discuss this internally with colleagues in your company. One of the questions that we challenge you to address by conclusion is to consider how would you make the case to your providers of financial capital to support a radical resource productivity innovation and helping you to pass that threshold of going beyond the early adopters to mass market take-up. The other question we ask you to reflect on is who would be the key champions inside your business? Would it be a certain department, a certain unit within your company? Would it be certain individuals? Take some time to reflect on that. Who are those key ambassadors and champions that you will work with to turn your enterprise into the resource revolution enterprise? We wish you all the best in embarking upon this journey of becoming the resource revolution enterprise. We hope you will stay in touch with updates and further information sources that we will add to this online resource, the Resource Revolution Trainer. Thank you for joining us.